Bishop Durr, my brother priests, brothers and sisters in the Lord, it's a great joy to welcome all of you here today for this first Eucharist in this brand new shrine to Our Lady of Good Voyage. In a very special way, we want to acknowledge and thank our honored guests for being here today. Baroness Hollins from London, who's on the commission with me in the Vatican, the Mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, the police commissioner. So glad that members of the Order of Sepulchre and Malta and so many others have joined us, and particularly grateful to the wonderful singers who just appeared like from magic. We hope that you'll be very happy here and stay on singing. You're doing such a great job. All of us are so grateful to John Hines, to Ethan Anthony, to Father Flavin, to Father Gaspar, to all of those who have worked so hard to bring us to this day. And we know that this place is going to be a place of many graces and blessings for so many. Father Jerry Reedy was my uncle. He baptized me in generations in our family. He presided at all the baptisms, first communions, and weddings that came along. Now that's my job. I'm the one who inherited that responsibility in the family. But I learned a great lesson from my uncle, who understood very well the psychology of the Irish people. He always gave the same gift to each couple that he married in the family, lest there be odious comparisons, rivalries, or recriminations among those relatives who are still speaking to each other, as we say. Father Jerry gave each couple that he married a copy of Da Vinci's Last Supper, which consequently graces the dining room of everybody in our extended family. I grew up as a child looking at that painting that depicts the Seder meal that became the first Eucharist. Much later, I came to learn that the venue of the Last Supper was in a building in Jerusalem. I never imagined as a child that someday I would visit that place. But one of the most memorable events in my life was the joy of being able to celebrate Mass in the cenacle, the place where Jesus celebrated the first Mass, which we call the Last Supper. The cenacle, also known as the upper room, was the first Catholic church. It appears in the Gospels as the venue where Jesus celebrates the Eucharist, washes the feet of his disciples, and ordains his apostles. The cenacle is then mentioned in the Gospel story of Easter and in the Acts of the Apostles, where Luke recounts the events around Pentecost. They're precisely the two readings which appear in today's Mass, which is the Mass of Mercy Sunday. In the first reading, we have a beautiful description of that first Catholic parish which gathered in the cenacle. There, as St. Luke records for us, they devoted themselves to the teachings of the apostles, their catechetical mission, to the communal life, fellowship, and fraternity. Indeed, discipleship is learned like a language by being part of a community that speaks that language. And that was the kind of community that was at the cenacle. Those first parishioners dedicated themselves to a life of prayer and service to the poor and those in need. And of course, the centerpiece of their life was the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist, the Sunday Mass. 2,000 years later, this is still what it means to be a Catholic. So welcome to our new cenacle. The Gospel today documents two of the apparitions of the risen Christ, both that take place in the cenacle, the upper room. The first apparition is on Easter Sunday. The next one week later, today. Jesus had predicted at the moment of his imminent arrest, "They shall strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." And that's precisely what happens on Good Friday. When Jesus is arrested, the apostles and disciples flee. Only the Blessed Mother, some of the women, and the youngest apostle, John, the teenager, accompanied Jesus to Calvary. But at Easter, the Good Shepherd returns to gather the scattered. He appears to Mary Magdalene, scattered in her grief. He calls her by name and gathers her to himself. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus were escaping from Jerusalem like the fall of Saigon. The Good Shepherd appears to them on the road. Their hearts were burning within them. Then they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. They were scattered in their fear, but the risen Lord gathers them to himself. Jesus appears to Peter, and 3 times says, "Peter, do you love me?" as if to erase the 3 times that Peter denies Jesus. And Jesus gathers Peter scattered in his cowardice. Sometimes it's dangerous and difficult to be a disciple, but Jesus gathers Peter and he says again, "Follow me." In today's gospel, Jesus appears again at the cenacle that had become the safe house for the apostles to hide. I say they went into the witness protection program after Good Friday. I am sure that the disciples were overjoyed to see that Jesus was alive. But they were also ashamed of their own cowardice. They didn't even muster enough courage to go and bury Jesus. A couple of rich Pharisees, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, did that. But Jesus does not accuse them or scold them. He shows them his wounded hands, as if to say, "See how much I love you." "Peace be with you," he says. Then he breathes on his apostles, like God breathing life into Adam. And he says, "Receive the Holy Spirit, whose sins you shall forgive. They are forgiven them." The first gift of Easter is the Spirit and God's mercy. 2 apostles were missing: Judas, who had committed suicide, and Thomas, who was called the twin, who was not with the community on Easter Sunday. I always say Thomas has many twins, those who don't make it to church every Sunday. But like Thomas, they are in peril of missing an encounter with the living Christ. The 10 apostles who were there reported to Thomas their experience of the apparition. Thomas is skeptical. There again, he has many twins. He says, "Unless I put my finger in the place of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." 1 week later, the risen Lord returns. This time, Thomas is present in the community. Jesus meets the apostles. Once again, he shows them his wounds and says, "Shalom Aleichem," peace be with you. And then to Thomas, "Put your finger in the place of the nails and your hand in the wound in my side, and be not unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas responds with the most beautiful act of faith in the Gospels: "My Lord and my God." Today's gospel is just one more example of how the Easter faith of the disciples is not the fruit of some religious exaltation or cheap psychological quirks, but it's a victory of the risen Lord over the doubts that paralyzed his disciples and friends. In other words, the gospel today was to show us the itinerary needed to arrive at faith here and now in him who comes and abides in our midst and who offers us his peace and the gift of the Spirit, and this in particular when we are gathered in the liturgical assembly, the greatest epiphany of the Christian community. I often remind people that Jesus manifests his presence in the Scriptures, in the sacraments, in the community of faith where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, and in the sacrament of the poor, the sick, the suffering, the least of our brothers and sisters. The apostles were surprised by joy. They had lost all hope of ever seeing Jesus again. Yet the appearance of the risen Lord to Thomas brings us a newfound faith in the doubting disciple. Recall how Jesus later on appears to St. Paul, who was at that time a fanatic Pharisee intent on stamping out Christianity. Jesus calls him to conversion, to friendship, to ministry. Paul's encounter with the risen Christ changed him from the fiercest enemy of the gospel to the greatest missionary in the history of the church. In today's gospel, the risen Lord, still gathering the scattered, gives us the last beatitude. In the Sermon on the Mount, we have the 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and so forth. But today we have the 9th Beatitude that Jesus says on Easter Sunday. Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. That is our beatitude. We see with the eyes of faith and can say to the risen Lord, as Thomas did, "My Lord and my God." Today we gather to consecrate this chapel so that it will be another cenacle, another upper room, where as Jesus' disciples we come together to devote ourselves to the teachings of the apostle, the communal life, the breaking of the bread. And hopefully, we will learn to share our possessions and gifts with our brothers and sisters and those in need. We are so grateful in God's providence and due to the hard work of so many faith-filled people that we have this beautiful space for our cenacle. Pope St. John Paul II once cited Dostoevsky. "Beauty will save the world," he said. The Holy Father went on to say, "Beauty is the key to the mystery and a call to transcendence. It's an invitation to savor life and to dream of the future." And that's why the beauty of created things can never fully satisfy. But beauty stirs that hidden nostalgia for God. The beauty of this shrine is precisely to allow people to glimpse God's goodness and beauty and to feel his loving presence in our midst, that nostalgia for the transcendence. The centerpiece of our ceremony of dedication of this sanctuary will be the consecration of the altar. This altar is not simply a piece of furniture. It's a sacred space where something holy happens. Noah built an altar after the flood. Abraham built an altar to sacrifice Isaac. There are 450 references to altars in the Bible. When I was a young priest and would prepare couples for marriage, I would always tell them that their dinner table was the altar in their family, where they gathered for their family meal. The altar in the church is the other table in our lives, where we gather with our extended family and with Christ, the head of our family, there to discover our identity as his disciples, to share our joys and our sorrows. This chapel, this cenacle exists so that crowds of strangers can become a community, a family, where we gather around the altar that we are about to dedicate. The altar is the table where the extended family with Christ gathers. It's also the place where Christ makes a gift of himself to us. I always say every altar is a leaf in the table from the cenacle, from the Last Supper. The first generations of Catholics celebrated Mass in the catacombs on the tombs of the martyrs. For that reason, we have a tradition of putting relics of saints in the altar so that we can be inspired by the faith and the example of the saints who have gone before us. Today in this altar, we will place relics of 3 saints. Saint Pedro Gonzalez, who is the patron saint of fishermen. The relics of Saint Faustina, who promoted the Divine Mercy devotion, and today is Divine Mercy's Sunday, and we're glad that her sisters are here. They generously donated her relics. We also have the relics of a Franciscan saint who is immensely popular, Saint Anthony of Padua, also known as Saint Anthony of Lisbon. He once went to the seashore and preached to the fishes because the people were not listening to his sermons. So when the congregation on Sleeper Street is zonked out, Father Flavin can go down and preach to the fish. But St. Anthony is also a good saint for this chapel because in many traditions, young women seeking husbands pray to St. Anthony. And this is going to be a great wedding chapel. In the Gospels, there's often a sharp contrast between the crowd and the community. The crowd is a collection of individuals who are often pushing people away from God, whereas the community has the mission of drawing people closer to the Lord and to one another. Like the disciples in the Gospel at Easter, we too have been scattered by our fears, our doubts, our failures, our disappointments, our losses, our problems. But here, the risen Lord, the Good Shepherd, is still gathering the scattered, binding up our wounds, healing our pain, helping us to be a family that allows people to discover God's love and forgiveness, where we learn to wash each other's feet and transform the crowds of individuals with conflicting agendas into a community that draws people closer to God and to one another, in a family that gathers around this sacred table to recognize the risen Lord in the breaking of the bread, as well as in the broken body of the poor and the suffering. This new cenacle is where we will grow into a family of Christ, where people share their lives with each other, and where we strive to be like those first Christians who were of one mind and one heart gathered in the cenacle.